People who have faith in the shroud as the burial cloth of Christ, but don't understand or don't know the science, when they get to know it and learn it, have more respect for the cloth because of that. Science truly followed and faith well followed blend to form the truth, and the truth is on that cloth.
One possibility, of course, is that we have some unknown man who was scourged, crucified, stabbed with a lance, crowned with thorns, who spent less than 3 days within his burial shroud and bears his image in such a way that it cannot be recreated with all the technology that exists today. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it may be Jesus the Christ.
This is your salvation. This is love in action.
The St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, in partnership with Patchwork Heart Ministry and Fiat Ministry Network, presents a podcast for families in crisis.
Hello, and welcome to a podcast from the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. This is Anne DeSantis, Executive Director for our 10 Saints series for families in crisis. We're already on episode 9. And I want to welcome our co-host here, Mickey. Mickey, Kelly, thank you so much for being a part of this series, as always.
Hi, Ann. Thank you so much for having me.
You. And Mickey, of course, is our board president. So it's a great collaborative effort that we've been doing every month with this series, because every podcast we've been talking about saints that make outreach, that are prayerful saints that you can intercede to for a family in crisis. And I think we have a perfect one for this one. This is for episode 9. We have St. John Bosco. And I want to just thank Mickey because it was his idea to do this one. So Mickey, thanks for offering this idea to talk about St. John Bosco.
Hi, Ann. Yes, honestly, I think St. John Bosco is really an interesting saint to look at. I mean, granted, he did work with a lot of I would say, like, at the time, like, at-risk youth. And he founded what's called the Salesian missions in Italy. And he's like basically he's basically the patron saint of youth. And he really worked with quite a bit of orphans and children who were missing a father figure. So I thought this was very appropriate to have, with our talk for this podcast episode.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so true. The first thing that I think of when I think of St. John Bosco is that he worked with many orphans, and he was like a father to them, right? He was a priest, and he was also like a father to them, guiding them along with the faith, catechizing them, and leading them into directions and making them feel welcome to the Catholic Church and that sense of family, because remember, these young children did not have, the parents around to guide them. And so he really made an impact on not only on their life, but mostly on their faith. And so I found a website, it's the SalesianMissions.org, where they have a big focus on St. John Bosco. And there's a short biography. I thought it might be a good idea just to kind of read through some of this, is that he was born in 1815 on August 16th, and was educating the faith, living according to the gospel message by his mother. So his mother was the one that taught him the faith. He was just 9 years old when he had a dream which called him to dedicate himself to the education of young people. While still a boy, he began to entertain his peers, and games alternated with work, prayer, and religious education. And then he became a priest in 1841. He chose as his life's program he says, to give me souls and take all the rest. And that's based from Genesis 14:21. He began his apostolate among 4 young people with the founding of the oratory, which he placed under the patronage of St. Francis de Sales. So that's why, hence, he's on the website for the Salesian missions. He led young people to meet Christ by means of his educational style and pastoral practice based on reason, religion, and loving kindness. He led young people to reflect, to meet Christ and their brothers and sisters, to study the faith, and to apostolic, civil, and professional commitment. St. Dominic Salvio stands out among the most outstanding fruits of his work. The source of his activity and of effectiveness of his work was his constant union with God and his unlimited confidence in Mary, our help, who he considered to be the inspiration and support of his whole work. Now, there's a little bit more on his biography there, but I thought there's enough for us to talk about. I think reading his biography, the idea that it said that he entertained his peers with games, alternated with work, prayer, and religious education. That's the image that I have of St. John Bosco, is that he definitely integrated like having fun. Because let's face it, when you're ministering to, say, little boys or little girls, no matter what they are, but especially boys, like to be outside, playing, having a good time. And he integrated that with work, prayer, and religious education. So let's talk about that, Mickey. As you know, you're a young man, and can you imagine what it would have been like for these young men to have been ministered to by St. John Bosco?
Well, I don't know if that remark was a compliment or were you serious about that, Anne? Because people are listening to this and they don't really see our faces quite as well, So, but actually, I just want to back up real quick. About you mentioned about St. John Bosco, how he was actually raised by his mom. Come to think of it, she actually was venerated by the church in 2006. So her name is Margarita Ochiena, and she actually is venerable, so she needs 2 miracles in order to be a canonized saint. And boy, but that would be something, to have, the mother of a saint in communion with her son, in the communion of saints. So let's pray that happens sooner or later. But yeah, and I mean, if you think about it, like back at the time, not many people in the day they really had. Let's face it, this is before iPhones, television, radio, and all that fun jazz. So everyone, they pretty much had to get out of their homes, their rooms, or their dwellings, or whatever, and come out and play. And for St. John Bosco, he too, he too had to, he actually he was inspired to really help these people that were living on the poverty levels. And honestly, I think that of course this is a different time too, because when Saint John Bosco was born, this was the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which ravaged the area. If you think about the French, they were in Italy, they were occupied Italy at the time under the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. And also there were times of famine and drought, which also played a factor. And of course, there's always going to be, one thing after another, especially when he was growing up. But also too, when I look at St. John Bosco, like he knew quite well that these kids need to, first off, they do need each other. Like they can't just be like by themselves in this faith journey. I think one quote that kind of like one quote that kind of jumps out at me about what St. John Bosco would say: enjoy yourself as much as you like, if only you keep from sin. In other words, you can have fun just as long as there's no sinful action creeps in, which is basically the end game of what you just said.
Yeah, well said. And thanks for all of that information. And just to back up a little bit with the comment about you understanding, I was referring to, obviously, could have you imagined when you were younger, below the age of 18, to have been ministered to him, because he was just an amazing presence for these young men and young people. And I can't even imagine what that would have been like. Of course, that was a long, long time ago. We're talking, 150 years ago, because he was born in 1815. So that's, more than that. But moving on to a little bit more about his bio, it says underneath his work and temperaments is that he left as an inheritance for his Salesian sons and daughters a form of religious life that was simple but founded on solid Christian virtue and on contemplation in action, which may have been summed up in the words work and temperance. And it goes on to say that he sought his best collaborators among his young people, thus establishing the Society of St. Francis de Sales. So that's where he found most of his people that he worked together in mission with were from these very young people that he ministered to. And they were the ones that carried on his mission. And honestly, if you think about it, I would believe that part of the reason that he's a saint is because those same people that he ministered to were the ones that made sure that miracles that were attributed to him were passed along and that others knew about him, because that's the way that it happens. And then it goes on to say in the same site that I'm reading is that finally, together with good and hardworking lay men and women, he created the Salesian cooperators to work alongside him and sustain the education of young people, thus anticipating new forms of apostolate in the church. In the centenary of his death, which took place on January 31st, 1888, Pope John Paul II proclaimed him the father and teacher of youth. I mean, that's a pretty big thing to be called the father and teacher of youth by Pope John Paul II, who, by the way, we did do a full podcast on him as well, Saint John Paul II. And I just think that he's a wonderful saint for us to pray and intercede to, for you, our listeners, the people who are listening to this podcast, who are those families in crisis. Because let's face it, a lot of times people who are in crisis are those kids who are feeling abandoned, or maybe are abandoned by parents because of different things that happen in life, whether it be something to do with abandonment or possibly incarceration or divorce, separation, those kinds of things, parents that die. I mean, let's talk about that, because wouldn't you say that this particular saint is the perfect saint for those who do not have the proper upbringing, parents that are right there by their sides to bring them up, and who do need extra help from someone so that they can learn the faith, know the faith, and also be safe and protected throughout childhood and even into adulthood.
Yes, and I honestly, like, the last time I checked, the Salesians, they are thriving, the missions, and they're needed now more than ever, especially if we look at what's been happening in the recent events, like throughout the world. And in fact, there's actually a saint that was a product of the Salesian missions named Saint Dominic Savio, another Italian saint. And he was actually um, he was under the he was a pupil of Saint John Bosco, and he actually died at a very young age. Yet he still lived, for a young kid, like just before his teenage years, that died of disease. But he too, like because of the example of Saint John Bosco, he would, you know, meet, cultivate a holy life. And I think it's something like when we look at Saint John Bosco too, and is that when we look at him, it's like I kind of saw him as like a spiritual, as like a father figure for some of these youth who lack that. And it's pretty common too if you think about the work conditions, the mortality rate at the time. Of course, there wasn't the medicine then, is not as good as we have now, and the way of life too. St. John Bosco just felt like he was called to something greater in his life, and he was determined. He was determined to really help. And he was ordained a priest of course, St. John Bosco. His first time with the city of Turin. And it was a really, at the time, industrialized. So there was widespread poverty in that city. And St. John Bosco saw this as a way for him to assimilate into these poor neighborhoods to help these kids. It was commonly referred to as Father Bosco. And he helped a large number of boys between 12 to 18. And he continued to help those boys. And he used many of his talents to help deliver the message of God to these children every day.
Wow, well said, because that's what they needed, right? They needed that message of God, because when you don't have parents or grandparents or family around you and you're below the age of 18, and sometimes even above the age of 18, uh, people like him made a tremendous difference for others. And think about this, not only during his lifetime, but those who have interceded to him over the years since he died in 1888. I also found on Catholic.org, there's also some information about him. And it says that while visiting the prisons that Father Bosco noticed a large number of boys between the ages of 12 and 18 inside. The conditions were deplorable, and he felt moved to do more to help other boys from ending up there. So he went into the streets and started to meet young men and boys where they worked and played. He used his talents as a performer, doing tricks to capture their attention, and then sharing with the children his message for the day. Wasn't that an ingenious way to do it? Think about it. Like, he didn't just walk over to them with like a catechism or a Bible or like his holy water, which of course they're all beautiful, wonderful things of our faith. But he did it through engaging them through like things that would make them want to talk to him, like having fun and tricks and engaging them that way so that they would want to know him more. And I think that's a great lesson for all of us when we want to evangelize with people that we know that are away from their faith or that need support, is that sometimes by just engaging people in the ways that are interesting to them might just be the best way to do it. Mickey, I don't know. What's your opinion on that?
In what way to do what in? I missed that part.
Yeah, I was just saying the fact that he engaged these boys, young boys, through through entertaining them through tricks, through outside play. He did it by getting to know them first. And I just wanted, the question I guess I was asking was, don't you think that that's kind of an ingenious way that he went about that he went about evangelizing them?
Well, and I mean, when I look at this, I mean, you know, this day and age, I mean, of course, this comes like I think this topic comes too when especially when the church has gone through waves of clergy abuse scandals and what have you. But you look at St. John Bosco, he really set the standard on how the priest should really help engage young children, making sure that they would have these opportunities to, like, I think the first step for St. John Bosco was, like you said, he did have to get to know them, like figure out gauge their with their comfort is, where their hobbies or where their interests lie. I think that's a very important step before you kind of throw them before you cast the net out into the deep, so to speak. For for St. John Bosco, he even saw that some of the boys want to learn how to do these tricks or whatever. And that I honestly think that it's good that you think I think it's also too, if you look at it from a professional standpoint, you're in charge of like a company or something, And some of the things you want to make sure is you want to gauge and like know the abilities of each of your employees before you task them for this to this department, that department, so on and so forth. And also too, when it comes to hiring, hiring someone. So say, for example, you have an opening in the accounting department or whatever the case is. One of the big things you want to like, in addition to looking at their degree and everything, you also want to look at their background. What experience can they bring to the table? If it's what you're looking for, you bring them in just like that. For St. John Bosco, kids about this, and here he's like, you know what? I want you guys to be part of my magic team, or it's commonly referred to as magic gospel, as they like to call it. And also at the same time, too, St. John Bosco even took these boys and sensed that some of them could actually should consider, a call to the priesthood. And that actually paid off. It paid dividends, too.
Good point, because when you think about it, even though that wasn't may not been at the top of his head, like, okay, I'm going to engage and minister to these boys because I'm trying to recruit to the priesthood, like maybe not did it come into his head, but either way, I mean, it was a fruit of everything that he did. And so I think that's an amazing thing to also examine. And I think we should also discuss his canonization. Like I said, I talked a little bit about that when I read from the other website a little while ago. But on this website, thecatholic.org, it has some good information here. It says that he died on January 31st, again on 1888, and the call for his canonization was immediate. Pope Pius IX knew that Father Bosco he knew him personally and agreed, declaring him blessed in 1929. St. John Bosco was canonized on Easter Sunday in 1934, and he was given the title Father and Teacher of Youth, which I did mention that before. And then in 2002, Pope John Paul II was petitioned to declare St. John Bosco as the patron of stage magicians. St. Bosco had pioneered the art of what is called gospel magic, and that's in quotes, using magic and other feats to attract attention and engage the youth. St. John Bosco is the patron saint of apprentices, editors and publishers, school children, magicians, and juvenile delinquents. And just so that everybody knows on this podcast, is that his feast day is on January 31st. So I believe we had a little bit of a mistake earlier that I think I might have said that John Paul II canonized him. That was incorrect.
What it actually was Pope Pius XI.
Right, that's right. And that in 2002, John Paul II petitioned to declare him the patron saint of stage magicians. So let's just make that clear who did canonize him, and that was in 1934. That he was canonized on Easter Sunday of that year as the father and teacher of youth. But isn't it interesting? Let's talk about those areas of his sainthood, because it says that he's the patron saint of apprentices, editors and publishers, school children, magicians, and juvenile delinquents. Let's talk about that.
Well, and I think you mentioned earlier that St. John Bosco, when he went to a prison, and of course, prisons were filled with juvenile delinquents, and most of the time, it's the lack of the father figure, and 90% you have like a 90% chance of going to jail, because let's face it. I remember when I was doing the consecration to St. Joseph recently, Father Donald Calloway made a point that the devil is looking for ways to divide the family. And as we were reminded, the devil is looking for one main vulnerable door to creep in, to infiltrate. And the big piece is the father. When the father is not there, the devil goes right in and cause division, in which we see that the father is not there. The children, deliberately defy their mom. They do this, whatever. And most of the time, it's the sons. They would, get in trouble in school. Eventually, they would be in the bad crowd and what have you, and they would be on the wrong side of the law. And there's no question, at the time of St. John Bosco, he was around. Like, he saw these delinquent minors, and he felt that you wouldn't get these kids, another chance at society, and it has paid dividends, for him. And of course, school children, let's face it, that many of these boys that St. John Bosco and his mother worked with were, school kids, 18 and younger. Apprentices, St. John Bosco, he brought some people along to do the magic thing for the magic gospel. And magicians, he showed some, he knew some magic tricks and put on display. So yeah, I mean, honestly, if there's ever an example we can look to, we look at St. John Bosco, especially how he dedicated most of his priestly ministry in helping the at-risk youth. And what a time and we do need more people to do the same, to help these kids fall back to someone that's willing to build them up instead of tearing them down, to give them that moral compass they need, to lead them to heaven, to teach them the skills that they would need in order for them to thrive as they become adults.
Absolutely. I mean, everything that you just said, because the needs in our world are at least what it was then, and probably even greater, because there's more people in the world, right? But I mean, and there's also more trouble in the world too. I believe life was maybe a little simpler back then than it is now. And I want to address the people that are listening to this podcast, because you might be listening and thinking, my family is not doing very well right now. Maybe you have a son or a daughter who's away from their faith, or a granddaughter or grandson or neighbor, whoever that is. Even it could be your brother or sister, and you're worried about them. This is the perfect saint for you to intercede to. And again, his feast day is January 31st. And that's a good day, because, for me, it rings a bell, because that's actually the day that my grandmother died. I was very close to her. So that particular date of her death is also his feast day. So just remember to pray to him, intercede. Of course, he's been canonized for quite a while. But he could always needs our prayers too, for the other saints that maybe he was instrumental in, other people who led saintly lives. So maybe he's already canonized, but there could be some people that he made an influence over who are not yet canonized. We just don't know, right? So please do pray for all the people for the lives that he influenced, because you don't know whether they may need our prayers too, in terms of the process of beatification. And even just for all the lives that he did affect and continues to affect at all times. So I just think that this was a very wonderful idea for us to discuss St. John Bosco, especially for our audience here, because he certainly understood what it felt like, and also what it felt like to minister to those families, because he grew up where it wasn't very easy for himself either. And he was able to fill in the blanks for other people as his life went on, for some of the things that he wasn't provided when he was a child. And so, Mickey, I didn't know if before you end, if you had any final words on this saint, because I'm just really glad that we spent some time talking about him.
I think maybe in the spirit of this podcast, I'd like to end this with a very good note. I actually will leave him, like maybe we can close this podcast with one of his famous quotes. When in danger or in need, have recourse to Mary. The Blessed Virgin has always helped me and will also do so.
Thank you. That was beautiful, because we can never forget that most of our saints, there were other saints that influenced them. And when we hear that it's the Blessed Mother, I mean, that's always a win-win, because the Blessed Mother is always interceding for all of us in so many ways. And so we're grateful for him, for his intercession. And I did find a little prayer that we can pray as we end. It says, to help the weak, cure the sick, convert sinners, grant through your intercession many vocations to the religious life. Attain for us, O Mary, help of Christians that have invoked you on earth, we may love and eternally thank you in heaven. St. John Bosco, pray for us. Mickey, thank you for joining us again on this podcast.
Thank you, Anne.
We'll see all of you here next month for our last episode of the 10 Saint series, where we will talk about St. Maximilian Kolbe. I have good news. We are going to do part 2 of the 10 Saint series for families in crisis. So you'll have a whole other set of 10 coming soon with Mickey and I. God bless everyone. We'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more information about the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, visit nonnatus.org or email director.srnf@gmail.com.